Hi there, I hope you're well. So this morning I'm going to be covering the up-to-date UK house price index for Scotland. This is for September. So Jim covered off August. As he said then, it literally runs a few months delayed because it's land registry numbers and those take about 3 months to be configured. So I'm going to be covering September for you, and some interesting stats in here actually, some nice changes from the August update. So I'm going to be sharing those with you. So we're going to look at some of the economic status that we find ourselves in at the moment. We're also going to look at the headline stats for September. We're going to look at the economic statement, price changes, sales volumes, so that's transactionals, property statuses, buyer status, funding status as well. Where are people getting the money from? We all want to know that. And how you can access that data, and just give you a little bit of a summary of our take on really what these numbers mean for you. So it was quite interesting, wasn't it? Jim predicted in the August update that potentially there was a reduction in the England base rates, and we did see that. So on the 7th of November, the Bank of England reduced the base rates from 5% to 4.75%. So that was like 0.25%. And I don't think people expected that. Now, some mortgages have been applied. If you've got a tracker, you can see that your mortgage in some instances with some of the banks has improved. Not every bank has done it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next. The next update, coincidentally, is actually this Saturday coming, the 7th of December. So it'll be interesting to see if they make a change on that. The next review really is dependent on what the Bank of England Monetary Fund think of inflation. Ideally, what they want inflation to look like is to be around about 2%. Now, in August, when we did the update, it was 1.7. At the start of this month, well, actually November, this is December now, at the start of November, it was sitting at 2.3. So that's actually higher than anticipated. Ideally, we want that sitting around 2%. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when they do that tomorrow. The summary that I'm going to be presenting to you today will show you some interesting stats, and we can have a wee chat through it. If there's something in there that's of impact to yourself, by all means, feel free to reach out. You can message me here as we're live, or you can message me after directly, just whatever your preference is if you're watching this later on. But it's a really good insight as to how you may be impacted and what's happening with prices in your area. Interestingly, we're also going to be covering, as I say, Scotland, but primarily we're going to be looking at Fife. Because you've got 5 properties, of course. But then we're also going to be looking at Dundee, because we now have Dundee properties, we have Glasgow properties and Edinburgh properties. So you're going to get some good insight to this as well. We know that we have people who live in the Fife area that also have homes in these areas. So it'll be interesting to see if there's pluses or minuses in those sales volumes, won't it? So I'm going to just take you through that just now. So let me just get those slides up. I won't be 1 second. And we'll see what these look like. Perfect. So here is your headline stats. So the headline stats at the moment are basically saying that at close of play September, the average price of a property in Scotland was £198,000. That is really affordable, isn't it? And with interest rates coming down as well, it's a great opportunity for people to perhaps think about changing homes. But when you look at wage as well, the average wage in Fife is about 33,000. So again, you tend to work in multiples of 6 or 7. So 198,000 is a really affordable point to be at in Fife, and in Scotland as a whole, of course. So when we look at also the price changes, Scotland as a whole, average price changes year on year from September 23 to September 24 is an increase of 5.7% on the average price of a property. And again, we'll break that down later on when we get into the statistics around your area to give you a bit of an insight as to what that looks like for you. The monthly price change for a property in Scotland was minus 0.09%. So pretty much on a whole there for September. But from January 15, if you look at the index figures overall, prices across the board have increased by 146.7. So really strong position to be in there as well. Economic statement, when we look at that, that's an interesting one as well. So the economic statement looks at annual price changes. And what they basically said in the economic statement is that in recent periods, the total transaction levels have decreased. Now, transaction levels really is what deciphers how healthy the property market is, not what a property is worth. When we're looking at transactional elements of it, we want to understand how many properties are transacting each year. And the reason for doing that is if people aren't buying properties, they're not needing tradesmen. So what we estimated is that actually there's about 10,000 properties transact in a 12-month period. If, say, someone is spending 10,000 improving, that actually works out at an astronomical sum. It works out nearly £100 million is being spent in a year on tradesmen. So you're looking at joiners, plumbers, decorators, removal firms, solicitors, everyone that basically bolsters that property market. So it's really interesting to see how that would impact things. Say there was a 20% reduction, that is huge in regards to numbers of monetary values. That's 20 million that potentially is not being spent in your local communities. So transactions really what give us the drive on how things are going. So really important to keep an eye on that. The average house price in Scotland increased by 5.7, as I said earlier on. So again, interesting to hear that that's a good position for us to be in. It's a strong position for us to be in. Makes a big difference in regards to what people perhaps are going to invest in. So if you look at price increases at 5.7 in the last 12 months to September, as I say, their average price, as already said, is 198,000. It's a provisional estimate because we are still waiting on final numbers coming in from the Land Registry, but this is a guide as to what they predict may be happening. But that's great that it's up from 5.3, which was the revised estimate from the previous month. So strong position compared to August into September. So good to see that that's happening. So are they higher than we anticipated? Let's hope so. If we look at UK house pricing as a whole, that was sitting at 2.9. So Scotland actually is faring pretty well at 5.7. That's a real strong position. As I say, this is provisional, but it is covering a 12-month period, so it does give us a bit of a good insight and a good position of understanding of where it might be. They talk about on a non-seasonally adjusted basis, average house prices in Scotland decreased by 0.9. That's a difficult one actually, because what that basically means is that they take that 1 month, they look at what it looks like, and they just tell you what the number is. But what that's not taken into account is the seasonality of property. As we all know, there are still some peaks and troughs. So the spring months, the summer months, you will see an influx of property coming to market, but that's not taken into account. So they don't seasonally adjust it. So what we're looking at doing is trying to give you a balance across the piece and say, actually, if we look at a full 12 months, this is what it looks like, not just on that 1 month. So it gives you a bit of an insight as well. But if we look at the non-seasonally adjusted basis, average house prices in Scotland, as I say, decreased by 0.9 between August to September 24, compared with a decrease of 1.2% in the same period 12 months ago. So still a stronger position. But on a seasonally adjusted basis, so again, that's where they do that adjustment across the year, average house prices in Scotland increased by 0.2% between August and September. So again, great to see that house prices are going up. What does that look like in regards to house prices? How does it affect you? Is it a particular property type, perhaps, that is doing really well? So in Scotland, semi-detached houses had the highest annual percentage change of all property types. That increased by 7%. That's a huge amount, but they're affordable family homes, aren't they? So I think that's the reason for that. So in the 12 months to September 2024, the average semi-detached property has increased by 7% and also to a value of 210,000. That is higher than the average price in Scotland overall, which we saw earlier at 198,000. So again, it shows you what types of property are selling. If you're in one of those, it's a great position for you to be in, isn't it? Or perhaps actually, if you are looking to downgrade or upsize, you've got a good idea of what you're likely to be paying in Scotland as a whole. So it gives you a good idea, doesn't it? Flats and masonettes had the lowest annual percentage change, which increased by 4.6% in the 12 months to September to an average price of 138,000. But again, in this location, you get some great ex-local authority apartments, don't you? 138,000 average, you could get a really good sized 3 or 4 bedroom apartment for that. So certainly something to think about, isn't it? In Scotland, 29 of the 32 local authority areas showed an increase in average house prices in the 12 months to September. So again, that shows us that there's actually a strong bolster of property and a good foundation still over the last 12 months. So that's what we want to see, isn't it? Because it gives us hope moving forward and it stabilises, as I mentioned, everything about the communities and also the influx of cash and the businesses and the supply chain that helps with property. So that makes it really healthy and keeps people employed as well. So really interesting to see that. Let's have a wee look at the price changes and what that means for us as well in regards to breaking it down into the areas. So I'm just going to get that slide up just now. Give me 1 wee second. So there you go. So there's that price changes there. So difficult for you to see, I know, but so if you look at this bottom line, we're looking at September 20 and it goes all the way along to September 24. So we can see again on the upside the percentages of increase in prices. So here we're sitting at a 4% increase in September 20. Then, as we anticipated, we kind of go into the kind of COVID and post-COVID periods where we did see a huge influx of pricing, didn't we? So you can see those big peaks there where it actually reached up to 15% on average over a home report that people were paying. That then comes down to about 12.5 when we get into March 22. Then things slows down. Liz Truss obviously didn't help on that. So that made that plummet a little bit. So you see it come really far down to minuses almost in 23. Going into the end of September 23. But actually what's really encouraging is we look at this 12 months from September 23 to 24, you can see those increases slowly going back up again. And we're sitting at about a 6% increase as a whole on annual price changes. So again, that's quite healthy, isn't it? So interesting to see that, and good to see how it impacts you. In Scotland, as I said, average prices are increasing by 5.7% over the last 12 months. So a real strong look at where the market sits. You will always have little microcosms in there. So you'll have places like Shetland Islands and Orkney, etc., where there are minimal house sales. And I'll show you that later on in regards to where perhaps they are peaking or not peaking. But again, it's not a true reflection in some of those areas. So that's looking at your price changes. Let's have a look at what that means for you as in your local authority. So let's zoom in on this. So I always find this part really interesting. So what we have here, if we look at the city of Aberdeen, for instance, that's sitting at 142,000 for September 24 against 135. That's actually quite encouraging because actually Aberdeen hasn't grown a great deal in the last while, certainly in the city of Aberdeen, and now it's sitting at 5.2%. So again, you're seeing an increase there, which I think is a really strong position for them to be in. If we then look at, say, the city of Dundee, so again, that's important for us because we're now operating in that area. So the city of Dundee are showing from September this year to September last year, they're increasing by 1.2%. So not as high as the average at 5.7, but still growth, which is great. Good to see that. Again, City of Edinburgh, it always seems to do very well, doesn't it? City of Edinburgh, your average house price, as you can see there, 346,837. That's gone up by 7.7%. That's a massive increase, isn't it? But a healthy position for them to be in. Great that we're now operating in that location as well. So again, if it's something that you'd like us to look at for you, reach out. City of Glasgow, 190,152 is the average price there. An increase of 6.2%. Again, really strong. Look at Clackmannanshire, 181,108 versus 172 nearly. Again, that's an increase of 5.3. So they're all round about that average or slightly higher. So quite interesting to see, isn't it? If we then look at, say, some of the Fife areas, for instance, if we look at Fife there, you can see Fife is sitting at 178,896. versus 176.5 the previous year. So that's an increase of 1.4. So still seeing growth in those areas, which is great. So across the piece, we're seeing some real good stability. Fife gets distorted a little bit because we do have a lot of new build properties at the moment. You've got the new builds in Kirkcaldy, Glenrothes, Dunfermline. So that does give a bit of a false reading because actually new build properties starting to struggle on the average pricing. If you look at the average price there for Fife at 178, wait till I show you what the average new build property price is versus the resale price, you'll really see a big impact. And that's primarily because new build properties, they're trying to be very eco-friendly, aren't they? And the stability and the requirements that the government are putting on them just now are really making that an expensive project. Yes, you have an eco-friendly property, but you pay a fair price for doing that. So interesting to see what that looks like in regards to the average prices and how it's impacted yourself. If we then go on and look at the areas, the geographics. So again, I really like this. If you're not into numbers and you prefer graphs, I think this is a really good one. So in September 24, the most expensive area to purchase a property was the city of Edinburgh. I've shown you that earlier on, and you can see that in the colours here. So you've got your 230,000 and overs are sitting right in that hotspot, aren't they? If you look at then the average cost at 347,000, that's certainly not a cheap area to live, isn't it, when you look at the multiples? But if you also then look at East Ayrshire and Inverclyde, where the average cost was only 132,000, again, you can see some real good areas where you can get affordable property. Interesting if you're into the stats. Then we're going to look at the average price change by property type. So I did mention earlier on about the semi-detached properties, but again, I think this is an interesting one because it does affect what you potentially own at the moment, but also if you're considering moving and what that looks like. Perhaps if you're a first-time buyer and you're looking to get into the market, you can get a good guide here in regards to what your affordability may be. So if we look at property types, September 24 versus September 23, detached properties, 347,250. You would expect that with the detached property. That's gone up by 6% year on year. Your semi-detached, as I said earlier, 210,220. That's gone up by 7%. But even your terraced at 168, that's 6.4%. But your flat and masonettes at 138,000 at 4.6%. Still affordable, isn't it, to get yourself on that property market? But overall, as I said, the average price in Scotland, 198,000, which is an increase of 5.7%. So again, good for you if you've got this property type. It's a good indicator as to if you're looking to move, what does that look like for you? If you're downsizing, perhaps if you're upsizing, you got a real good feel for what you potentially can look to move to. We're now going to look at sales volumes. So sales volumes are basically the transactions. Bear with me, I've had a bit of a cold. So if we look at the city of Aberdeen, for instance, excuse me, as I say, I've had a bit of a cold. City of Aberdeen were 396 transactions versus 350. So again, you have seen that growth in Aberdeen. So strong growth. Dundee again as well. City of Dundee, 244 transactions versus 212. And it goes back to what I said earlier. The transactions is the important part of if the property market is healthy. It's not what your property is worth. Obviously, we all want to see an increase in our property values, but actually your transactionals are the thing that really tells us, going back to that economic and how it impacts all your supply chain. So again, to see Dundee improving is great. And also, when we saw earlier on, they had a 1.2% growth plan as well in regards to price increase. So again, really healthy looking. City of Edinburgh, we saw a massive increase in prices there, as we saw earlier, at 7.7%. But also we've seen a really good increase in regards to transactions, 975 transactions versus 919 the previous year. So again, you're seeing that growth there. Glasgow, City of Glasgow, the same, 915 versus 849. Clackmannanshire, 61, slightly less versus 86, but again, it's a smaller number, so not to be a concern. Dumfries and Galloway, 204. If we then go down and we look at East Lothian, 168 versus 191. So it certainly seems to be the City of Edinburgh rather than the surrounding areas that are seeing the positive impacts. But then Fife, which is really encouraging, 597 transactions versus 585. So our market is healthy, so really good to see that. And I think that gives you a good inroads to, as I said earlier on, how that may or may not impact yourself if you're thinking of potentially moving. So healthy market there. What we're now going to look at is the sales volumes as across the piece in regards to the last few years and what that looked like in average pounds. Versus the transactions over that period. So in the last 5 years, 2020, 5,300. We then saw that big boost, didn't we, when COVID and post-COVID hit. You'd expect to see transactional levels going up. Then we saw sales volume going up again in July 22. It dipped a little bit into July 23, purely and simply because of obviously that economy. And Liz Truss didn't help with that. And the people were so uncertain with mortgages, weren't they, that they didn't really have that comfort and confidence in the market to move. But great that we've seen now in July that it's increased to 8624. So we're getting back to kind of even before pandemic levels, a really strong increase there. So really positive to see that. If we then look like property status, I mentioned earlier on about the fact that new build properties are really expensive in regards to comparables to existing resale properties. What do I mean by that? Existing resale properties are basically properties that have already been lived in that are then being sold again. And if you look at the averages there, for the average price in July for a new build was 325,356, whereas an existing resale property was 190,072 pounds. So that monthly change is 8.7 versus 2.2, but your annual change is 25% on a new build property versus 2.6% on a resale property. That's just unattainable, isn't it? Especially when we've got the situation where housing is at a crisis point and we absolutely need more property. If there isn't some kind of lapse in the strong requirements that are being enforced on new builders at that price point, you can't see how that's attainable. However, having said that, in Fife, we absolutely have a lot of areas where there is new property being built. We've got Kirkcaldy, as I said earlier, Dunfermline, Glenrothes. We're seeing these properties go up. There's some plots coming available, obviously, in the East Neuk, as you'll have seen if you're over that way. So new properties are being built, but they're being built at a high price premium. And it's because of this eco requirement that's been set on them. So it is making it slightly harder for new builders. If you look at the ones in Collinsborough, for instance, the average property there, I believe, is coming on at around about 350,000. So that's around about the same price as that average new build in Scotland. So that's quite substantially different when you look at the 190,000 on a resale, isn't it? But again, it just depends, I guess, what your financial situation is and your positioning. But that's just giving you a bit of an explanation as to why they are so different in price points. If we look at buyer status, which I think is always a really interesting one. So if you look at your type of buyers, average price September's for 24, your first time buyers, their average spend was 159,444. On a monthly change, that was minus 0.7%, but on an annual change, it's 5.6%. So 5.6% of properties that are being spent and purchased by first-time buyers are being purchased at just under that £160,000 point. If you look at the former owner-occupiers, so again, obviously, someone who's bought a house, they're moving on, they're averaging £238,102 on an average property, which is minus 1%, but actually an increase annually of 5.8%. So quite a big jump, but it's interesting to see that. So it's good to see that the first-time buyers are still investing, which keeps this former occupiers positioning. Obviously, it keeps that cycle going, doesn't it? Funding status, where is it coming from? People are asking me all the time, where are the cash buyers? Are they out there? Well, actually, this will give you a good insight to it. So the average price in September for a cash buyer was £180,227 versus someone on a mortgage at £206,702. So on an annual change for cash buyers, that's 4.5%. For mortgage holders, it's 6.13. But if you look at that cash buyer average up to September at 180,000, say you're sat at the moment, perhaps you're selling a property and you've got a property at 350,000 and your chain perhaps is depending on a cash buyer coming along, you might want to rethink your decision process, because actually if cash buyers are spending up to on average 180,000, then you may need to flex your decision making in regards to who you choose as your buyer, and perhaps someone who is cash and mortgage might be the better option for you. Just something for you to think about in regards to your status. If you're maybe had your house on for a while and that's your stipulation that you wanted a cash buyer, you may need to look at, have a discussion with your estate agent. Well, what does that really mean in real terms for me? And is that cash buyer actually likely to be out there? So again, just really something for you to think about. That really covers the funding status, and that brings us really to the end of the kind of stats part of it. So I'm just going to stop sharing that with you just now. So interesting numbers in there, isn't it? So it'll be interesting to see how that also gets impacted tomorrow when the budget announcement is made. Will there be a change? Will there not be a change? We're not really sure yet. The indicators, we're not confident that there'll be a change. You can't see it when inflation is sitting at 2.3, and they really ideally wanted inflation to be sat around about 2% before they make that change. But we just have to see how that's going to transpire. The market looks healthy in growth and transactional numbers. I've shown you that, so that's a really good thing. That's a positive. Interest rates did reduce to 4.75. Will they move further forward? Let's wait and see how that moves. But it should drive mortgage buyers, and we've seen that there on that last stat there, how mortgage buyers are the most spenders at the moment. Hopefully that will keep things going there as well. Many people are coming up to the point where they're now at the situation where their mortgage fixed rates are expiring, so they're going to be exploring that, and how does that impact them? What are the good options out there for them? So it'll be interesting to see how that happens. Thankfully, I'm on a flexible mortgage at the moment because mine ran out when the interest rates started to change quite a bit. So we did benefit actually from that drop in November. So it'll be interesting to see if there's going to be another drop for December and see how that impacts us and how that kind of puts a little bit more money in our pocket, which everybody wants, don't they? At the end of the day, you can spend it on a bigger house, or you can actually do some savings with it, invest as well if you wished. So good to see that the economy is keeping strong. Good to see those transactional numbers are keeping there. That's allowing the market to go from strength to strength, and it's also keeping that supply chain and all those contractors earning money as well. And that's it from me. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out afterwards if you'd like. Follow our channels. As I said earlier on, we're Fife Properties, we're Edinburgh Properties, we're Dundee Properties, and we're Glasgow Properties now. And it's Perry from Properties TV, I guess now. That's grand. Take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye.